The old house on Elm Street had always held a certain quiet dread, a hush that settled over it even in the midday sun. Locals in the small town of tucked away in the heart of Vermont would tell you stories if you pressed them, their voices dropping to a near whisper as the tales unfolded. They spoke of Sarah, a young woman who lived there in the early 1900s, her life a tapestry woven with tragedy and unanswered questions. It began subtly, as these things often do, with the feeling of being watched when no one else was around. A cold draft in a closed room, the faint scent of lavender where no lavender bloomed, and the undeniable sense that she was not alone within those four walls. Sarah, a practical woman, initially dismissed it as an overactive imagination, a byproduct of living alone after her parents had passed on. But the whispers began, soft and indistinct at first, like the rustling of dry leaves just outside her window even when the air was still. They seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the house itself, a low, sorrowful hum that only she could perceive. It was unnerving, to say the least, and soon her nights were plagued by a restlessness that sleep could not conquer. She'd lie awake, staring at the darkened ceiling, listening, always listening for the next faint murmur. Then came the apparitions, fleeting glimpses that made her doubt her own sanity. A shadow at the edge of her vision, a flicker of a dress disappearing around a corner, the impression of a face in the reflection of a window, gone as soon as she turned to meet it directly. One particularly unsettling evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the ancient panes, Sarah sat by the fireplace, trying to lose herself in a book. A subtle creak on the staircase drew her attention. She looked up, her heart giving a little lurch, and there at the landing stood a figure. It was indistinct, a wavering outline but undeniably feminine, with long, flowing hair and what seemed to be a white gown. It remained for only a moment, a silent, sorrowful presence, before dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been. Sarah didn't scream, couldn't scream. A cold dread had seized her, a sensation far more profound than mere fear. It was the crushing weight of knowing, the undeniable proof that her house held a secret, a sorrowful inhabitant who shared her space. She started researching, poring over old town records and speaking with the oldest residents, those with memories stretching back further than most. She learned of a young woman named, who had lived in the house before Sarah's family, decades earlier, had been engaged to be married, deeply in love, but her had mysteriously vanished just weeks before their wedding, never to be seen again. Overwhelmed by grief and a loneliness that consumed her, had taken her own life within those very walls, some whispered in the attic, though no official record confirmed it. The story brought a chilling clarity to Sarah. The sorrow she felt, the whispers, the mournful apparition, it all aligned with a woman consumed by heartbreak. Sarah began to talk to, softly, gently, explaining that she understood, that she felt her pain. She'd leave small offerings, a freshly cut rose from her garden, a delicate lace handkerchief, placed on the antique dresser in the guest room, a room that was said to have favored. The atmosphere in the house slowly shifted. The cold spots lessened, the whispers softened, becoming less frequent, less sorrowful, sometimes even feeling like a gentle sigh of understanding. Sarah never saw the full apparition again, only the occasional fleeting shadow, a whisper of movement that no longer instilled fear, but a quiet sense of companionship. She felt that was finally at peace, or at least found a measure of solace in being acknowledged, in having her tragic story heard. Sarah continued to live in the house for many more years, always respectful of the quiet presence that remained, a silent guardian in the corner of her life. And though the house eventually passed into other hands, the legend of the heartbroken bride and Sarah, the compassionate listener, became an enduring part of whispered history, a reminder that sometimes the past just needs someone to listen. In the dusty archives of the old library in Charleston, South Carolina, a series of forgotten letters lay hidden for decades, only to be discovered by a curious local historian named Arthur Finch. These letters, brittle with age, told a fragmented but deeply unsettling tale of the Montgomery family, who lived in a grand antebellum mansion on the outskirts of the city in the mid-1800s. The head of the household, Mr. Montgomery, was a renowned collector of rare artifacts, and it was one particular acquisition that seemed to unravel the very fabric of their existence. The first letter, penned by Mrs. Montgomery, spoke of a peculiar wooden music box had brought home from an obscure auction. It was intricately carved, depicting strange, almost disturbing figures in a circular dance, and when wound, it played a haunting, discordant melody that seemed to seep into the very stones of the house. Wrote of an immediate disquiet she felt in its presence, a subtle chill that pervaded the air around it, even on the warmest southern days. Initially was enchanted by his new possession. He'd spend hours winding the box, listening to its eerie tune, oblivious to the growing unease among his family and staff. Their young daughter, a delicate child prone to vivid dreams, began to speak of a shadow man who visited her room at night, always after the music box had played. He never spoke, she said, but simply watched her from the foot of her bed, a tall, silent silhouette against the moonlit window. Worried, tried to dissuade from keeping the box, but he dismissed her concerns as mere superstition, attributing fears to childish nightmares. However, the occurrences escalated. Objects would be moved from their accustomed places, doors would creak open and shut on their own, and the discordant melody of the music box would sometimes play even when no one had wound it. The family servants grew terrified, many of them eventually refusing to enter the parlor where the box resided. The second letter, written several months later, revealed a more desperate tone, described increasing obsession with the music box. He had become withdrawn, spending his days in the parlor, sometimes talking to himself, his once sharp mind seeming to fray at the edges. Night terrors grew more intense, her descriptions of the shadow man becoming more vivid, more sinister. She spoke of its eyes, like holes in the darkness, and the cold, oppressive feeling it left in her room. One morning, the family awoke to find its beloved porcelain doll, a gift from her grandmother, lying shattered at the foot of her bed, its delicate china face cracked beyond repair. There was no explanation, no sign of forced entry, just the chilling implication of a malevolent presence. Now truly terrified, secretly contacted a local priest, Father Michael, for guidance. Father Michael, a skeptical but compassionate man, visited the mansion, his initial disbelief quickly eroding as he witnessed some of the strange phenomena himself. He felt the oppressive cold, heard the faint, disembodied whispers, and was particularly disturbed by the music box, which he described as exuding a palpable aura of malevolence. He conducted an exorcism, blessing the house, anointing every room with holy water and praying fervently. During the ritual, as he approached the music box later recounted in her letter, the box began to play on its own, its melody louder, more frantic than ever before. A chill wind seemed to sweep through the parlor, extinguishing the candles, and a guttural, inhuman growl echoed from the shadows. Father Michael, shaken but resolute, continued his prayers until the music box fell silent once more. For a brief period, the house felt lighter. His nightmares subsided and, though still somewhat distant, seemed to regain a measure of his former self. But the respite was fleeting. The third and final letter, found amongst personal effects, was written in a trembling hand, her words a desperate plea. She spoke of the shadow man returning, bolder and more menacing than before. It no longer just watched, but seemed to actively torment her, whispering unspeakable things that made the child weep uncontrollably. The music box, though never wound, would emit its eerie tune at odd hours, always just as the house settled into the deepest quiet of the night. Described how the music seemed to draw something, to call it forth from the very depths of the shadows. One terrible night, wrote, she was awakened by screams. Rushing into her daughter's room, she found the child huddled in a corner, pointing a trembling finger at the empty space at the foot of her bed. Was inconsolable, whimpering about the shadow man and its chilling touch. Roused by the commotion, stumbled into the room, his eyes wide with a terror that finally matched hers. He, too, realized with a fresh wave of dread had seen something. In the days that followed, fell ill, a mysterious wasting sickness that baffled the local doctors. She grew weaker, her vibrant spirit slowly fading, until one sorrowful morning she passed away in her sleep. The family was devastated, but grief was compounded by a chilling certainty. The music box and whatever malevolent entity it harbored was responsible. The final lines of his letter were almost illegible, scrawled in a frantic hand. Has taken it. He says he will bury it where no one will ever find it. We must break its hold. I pray it is not too late for us all. Arthur Finch, the historian, closed the last letter with a profound sense of unease. He learned that Montgomery had indeed vanished a few weeks after his death, leaving alone in the grand, haunted mansion. She died a few years later, a broken woman, the house falling into disrepair, its secrets buried deep within its walls and perhaps with. The music box was never found, its whereabouts remaining a chilling mystery, a testament to the lingering power of certain artifacts and the shadows they can invite into our lives. Deep in the remote mountains of the Appalachian Trail, in a region known for its ancient forests and whispered legends, a solitary hiker named Hayes encountered something that would forever alter his understanding of the natural world, and perhaps reality itself. Was an experienced outdoorsman, accustomed to the solitude and the quiet grandeur of the wilderness. He was on a multi-day trek, seeking to escape the clamor of city life, when a sudden, unexpected fog rolled in, thick and disorienting, swallowing the familiar landmarks and plunging the forest into an eerie, hushed silence. He checked his compass, but the needle spun erratically, as if confused by an unseen magnetic anomaly. Realizing he was hopelessly lost, he decided to set up a makeshift camp, hoping the fog would lift by morning. As dusk began to paint the sky with shades of bruised purple and deep indigo, an unsettling feeling crept over. The silence of the forest was not the usual peaceful quiet he cherished. It was a heavy, unnatural stillness, devoid of the chirping of crickets or the rustle of small animals. He built a small fire, its flickering flames providing the only comfort against the encroaching darkness and the oppressive fog. That's when he heard it, a sound he couldn't quite place. It wasn't an animal cry, nor the wind, but a low, rhythmic thumping, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, seeming to pulsate from the very ground beneath him. It sounded like a slow, deliberate drumbeat, deep and resonant, yet utterly devoid of any human origin. He stood up, peering into the swirling mist, his heart beginning to beat a frantic tattoo against his ribs. The sound felt ancient, primal, stirring something deep within him, a sense of awe mingled with a profound dread. He called out, his voice swallowed by the fog, his words feeling weak and insignificant against the booming rhythm. The thumping grew louder still, closer, and he could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots. He started to back away slowly, clutching his hiking pole like a lifeline, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of white. Then, through a momentary thinning of the fog, he saw it. A colossal shadow, impossibly tall, seemed to materialize among the trees. It was indistinct, a wavering outline, but its sheer scale was terrifying. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, each rhythmic thud echoing its monstrous steps. Couldn't discern any features, no eyes, no limbs, just a towering, dark mass that seemed to absorb the faint light of his fire. It was a silhouette against a backdrop of nothingness, a void moving through the forest. A profound, bone-chilling cold swept over him, far colder than the mountain air, and a sense of absolute power emanated from the entity. He felt an urge to flee, to scream, but his feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror so complete it transcended his physical being. He was witnessing something beyond human comprehension, an ancient, elemental presence that predated all recorded history. The rhythmic thumping continued, each beat shaking the very ground, and the shadow moved closer, its vastness filling his entire field of vision. He could feel its presence now, a cold, silent scrutiny, a heavy weight pressing down on his mind. There was no malice, no anger, just an indifferent, ancient power that simply was. It felt like he was observing a force of nature, something akin to a mountain or a hurricane, but imbued with a terrifying sentience. Just as he felt his sanity begin to fray, just as the darkness seemed to be reaching out to engulf him, the fog began to dissipate, as quickly and mysteriously as it had arrived. The trees reappeared, the mountain peaks faintly visible in the distance, and the chilling cold began to recede. The rhythmic thumping softened, grew distant, until it was nothing more than a faint vibration in the ground, then vanished entirely. The colossal shadow was gone. Collapsed by his fire, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. He stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled by the dwindling embers, his mind reeling from the encounter. He never spoke of it to anyone, knowing that no one would believe him, that it sounded like the ravings of a madman. But the memory remained, burned into his consciousness, a silent testament to the vast, unknowable mysteries that lie hidden in the ancient corners of our world, just waiting for the right conditions. a thick fog, a lost traveler, to reveal themselves. He continued to hike, but never again with the same innocent delight. He now carried with him a profound respect and a deep-seated fear for the whispers from the past that still echo in the wild, untamed places. In a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, nestled among towering firs and rose gardens, stood a seemingly ordinary two-story house. But for the Miller family, Sarah and Tom, and their two children, 8-year-old Lily and 12-year-old Jake, it became the stage for a series of subtle, yet increasingly unsettling events that all rational explanation. They had moved into the house, built in the 1960s, a year prior, drawn by its spacious yard and good school district. At first, the strange occurrences were easily dismissed. A door left ajar that they were certain they had closed, a light left on when everyone had gone to bed, the faint scent of pipe tobacco that neither Tom nor anyone in their family smoked. These were minor anomalies, quickly forgotten in the busyness of everyday life. But then Lily started talking about her invisible friend. This friend, she claimed, lived in her closet and sometimes played with her toys. Sarah and Tom initially found it endearing, a normal part of a child's imagination. However, Lily's descriptions grew more specific. She said her friend was an old man with kind eyes and a preference for checkerboard shirts, and that he missed his dog, a golden retriever named Rusty. This level of detail, especially the specific clothing and the dog's name, began to prick at Sarah's subconscious. She tried to subtly ask around the neighborhood if anyone knew the previous owners, or if there was an elderly man who had lived in their house before. No one seemed to recall specifics, only vague mentions of an older gentleman who had passed away years ago. Meanwhile, Jake, the more skeptical of the children, began to experience his own unsettling encounters. His bedroom, located directly above the living room, would often be cold, even when the heating was on full blast. He would hear faint, insistent tapping sounds emanating from the walls, sometimes spelling out what sounded like letters in Morse code, though he couldn't quite decipher them. One evening, while Jake was playing video games in his room, his controller suddenly flew off his bed, striking the wall with a sharp crack. There was no open window, no gust of wind, just the inexplicable movement of an object. He told his parents who, while trying to remain calm, couldn't offer any logical explanation. The incidents were becoming too frequent, too specific, to be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. The pipe tobacco scent became more prevalent, sometimes filling the kitchen or the hallway, and they would occasionally hear a distinct, elderly cough coming from downstairs when no one was there. One night, Sarah was woken by the sound of what seemed to be someone rummaging through old papers in the study, located off the living room. Thinking it was Tom, she called out to him, but received no reply. Getting out of bed, she went downstairs, her heart thudding softly in her chest. The study door was ajar, a faint light emanating from within. She pushed it open further, and there, on the antique desk, a stack of old letters previously neatly piled, lay scattered across the surface. A wave of cold air washed over her, and she distinctly heard a sigh close by, as if someone had just exhaled right next to her ear. She fled back upstairs, her skin crawling, and told Tom everything. They decided to delve deeper into the house's history. Through old property records and persistent questioning of local historians, They finally uncovered the story of Thomas, who had lived in their house from the late 1960s until his death in the late 1990s. He was a widower, a retired professor, and indeed, a pipe smoker. More chillingly, his beloved golden retriever, Rusty, had passed away just a few months before Thomas himself. And in his later years, Thomas had suffered from a persistent cough. The details perfectly matched Lily's invisible friend and the unexplained occurrences. It seemed old Thomas was still very much a presence in his beloved home. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah and Tom decided to address the situation directly. One evening, sitting in the living room, they spoke aloud to Thomas, respectfully acknowledging his presence, his life, and his lingering attachment to the house. They told him they were grateful to be living in his home, that they would take good care of it, and that his memory was safe with them. Lily, sitting quietly on the couch, suddenly pointed towards the hallway. "He's smiling," she whispered. "He says thank you for remembering Rusty." From that day forward, the unsettling incidents began to subside. The pipe tobacco scent became rare, the cold spots vanished, and Lily's invisible friend gradually became less frequent in her conversations, though she still spoke of him with affection. The Miller family learned to live with the quiet understanding that they shared their home with a gentle, lingering spirit. It wasn't a malicious haunting, but a presence born of love and attachment, a final whisper from the past of a man who simply wasn't ready to leave the comfort of his home and the memory of his loyal dog. It was a reminder that sometimes the supernatural isn't about terror, but about connection, about the echoes of lives lived, and the subtle ways they can continue to touch the present. The house on the quiet Portland street became not just a home, but a living testament to memory and unseen companionship, a place where the past and present gently intertwined. And so, their lives took on a new rhythm, one that included an unspoken deference to the unseen occupant of their home. Sarah found herself leaving a bowl of fresh water on the back porch some mornings, an almost unconscious gesture, as if for a thirsty dog, and she never quite brought herself to move the old, somewhat worn armchair in the study, knowing it had been Thomas's favorite. Tom, ever the pragmatist, found a strange comfort in the idea of Thomas overseeing the house, a silent guardian against the inevitable wear and tear of time. He even started collecting vintage pipes, not to smoke, but simply to display in the study, a subtle nod to the previous owner's preferences, and perhaps a small offering of continued welcome. Jake, whose initial fear had transformed into a grudging curiosity, would sometimes talk to the empty air in his room, asking questions about the house or even about history, wondering if the professor was listening. He never heard the tapping again, but sometimes a book he was looking for would mysteriously appear on his desk, as if guided by an unseen hand. Lily, of course, continued to be the most attuned. Her friend was no longer a constant companion, but a quiet, gentle presence, a feeling of warmth in a cold room, a sudden, inexplicable sense of peace. She would sometimes draw pictures of an old man with a kind smile and a golden retriever, her understanding of Thomas and Rusty now deeply ingrained in her childlike heart. The house, once just a structure of wood and plaster, had become something more, something imbued with a gentle, lingering history. It was a place where stories unfolded, both seen and unseen, where the past wasn't just a memory, but a palpable thread in the fabric of daily life. The Millers learned that true haunting wasn't always about malevolence or terror, but often about lingering emotions, unfinished farewells, and the quiet comfort of familiarity that even death couldn't entirely erase. It was a beautiful, if unconventional, lesson, whispered through the quiet moments of their lives in that ordinary-looking house in Portland. They understood that some connections transcend time and space, and that sometimes all a restless spirit needs is a bit of respect, and the gentle offer of companionship in the quiet hours of the night. Their story became a quiet testament to the idea that our homes are more than just buildings. They are vessels for the echoes of lives, and sometimes those echoes choose to stay, watching over the new chapters unfolding within their beloved walls. Far from the bustling streets of any city, nestled deep within the dense, ancient forests of northern Minnesota, stood a derelict logging cabin. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its roof caving in, a silent testament to a bygone era. For local thrill-seekers and urban explorers, it was a place of legend, whispered about in hushed tones around campfires, a spot where many claimed to have experienced inexplicable phenomena. Among these curious adventurers was a young woman named, a photographer with a passion for capturing the beauty of decay and the mysteries of forgotten places. She wasn't a believer in ghosts, not truly, but the stories of the Whispering Woods cabin intrigued her enough to venture out there alone, armed with her camera and a healthy dose of skepticism. The journey to the cabin was arduous, requiring a several-mile trek through overgrown trails and dense underbrush. The air grew heavier as she approached, the sounds of the forest seeming to recede, replaced by an unnerving quiet. When she finally emerged into the small clearing where the cabin stood, a subtle chill permeated the air, despite the warmth of the late summer afternoon. The cabin itself was a mournful sight, half swallowed by the encroaching wilderness, its dark maw of a doorway inviting a closer look. Ever the photographer began to document its slow surrender to nature, carefully stepping over fallen timbers and decaying floorboards, her camera clicking softly. The interior was a jumble of collapsed furniture, rusted tools, and a thick layer of dust that coated everything like a shroud. As she moved deeper inside, a strange feeling settled over her, an inexplicable sense of being watched, a pressure on the back of her neck that made the hairs stand on end. She paused, listening intently, but heard nothing save the gentle creaking of the old wood and the distant caw of a crow. She dismissed it as the natural unease of being alone in such a desolate place. Then, as she framed a shot of a rusted stove in what was once the kitchen, she heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, seemed to drift from the adjacent room, the one that must have been a bedroom. It was too indistinct to make out words, but the sound itself was undeniably human, a soft, sorrowful sigh. Skepticism wavered. She slowly lowered her camera, her heart beginning to pound. She called out, her voice a little shaky. "Hello, is anyone here?" Only the silence answered, deeper and more profound than before. Yet the feeling of not being alone intensified, a tangible weight in the air. She cautiously moved towards the bedroom doorway, her camera still clutched in her hand, ready to use it as a makeshift shield if needed. The room was even more dilapidated, a collapsed bed frame in the corner, a broken mirror reflecting only the dust and shadows. As she stepped across the threshold, a sudden, icy gust of wind swept through the room, though all the windows were either boarded up or too small to create such a draft. And with that gust came a clearer whisper, a distinct woman's voice, mournful and low, uttering a single word: lost. Froze, a primal fear seizing her. This was no trick of the mind, no creaking wood. This was real. She felt a profound sadness emanating from the very air, a sense of deep, inconsolable grief. She didn't flee immediately, but stood there, caught between terror and a strange sense of empathy. She whispered back, her voice barely audible, "What's lost?" Another long moment of silence, then the whisper came again, fainter this time, but unmistakably clear. "My child." A wave of profound sorrow washed over, so strong it brought tears to her eyes. She felt the heavy burden of a mother's unending grief, trapped within the decaying walls of the cabin. She snapped a few hurried photos, not of the room's physical decay, but of the empty spaces, the lingering shadows, trying to capture the feeling of desolation she felt. As she turned to leave, a small, faded locket caught her eye, lying half buried in the dust on the floorboards by the collapsed bed. She carefully picked it up, her fingers brushing away the grime to reveal an old, tarnished silver locket, engraved with a delicate rose. Inside, she found two tiny sepia-toned photographs, one of a stern-faced man and the other of a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with kind, tired eyes, holding a cherubic infant in her arms. This, she instinctively knew, was the woman, the mother, who was trapped here, mourning her lost child. Felt an overwhelming urge to do something, anything, to bring a measure of peace to this lingering sorrow. She left the locket on the windowsill, where it could catch the last rays of the setting sun, a small gesture of and respect. As she hiked back through the now darkening woods, the heavy silence seemed to have lifted, replaced by the familiar sounds of evening crickets and the rustle of leaves. The oppressive cold was gone, and while she still felt a lingering sadness, it was now tinged with a faint sense of release, as if her small act had offered a momentary solace. Never returned to the Whispering Woods cabin, but the experience stayed with her, a chilling yet profoundly human encounter with a past that refused to fade. It taught her that some places hold onto the echoes of tragedy with an unwavering grip, and that sometimes a simple act of listening, of acknowledging a forgotten sorrow, can be a powerful balm, even for those who dwell in the realm between worlds. The quiet whisper of a lost child, carried on the wind through ancient trees, became a permanent fixture in her understanding of the world, a reminder of the unseen emotional landscapes that exist alongside our own. On the windswept coast of Maine, in a small, isolated lighthouse that stood sentinel against the crashing waves, a young keeper named David Miller experienced a haunting so subtle, yet so persistent, that it slowly began to erode his carefully constructed reality. David was a solitary man, drawn to the lonely vigil of the lighthouse, finding a quiet purpose in its rhythmic beams slicing through the darkness. He had taken the post after the sudden, unexplained disappearance of the previous keeper, an older man named Blackwood, who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his journal and a lingering sense of unease. The Coast Guard had conducted a thorough search, but found no sign of, eventually attributing his disappearance to a rogue wave or a moment of disorientation in a storm. David, a practical man, accepted this explanation, but the isolation of the lighthouse began to subtly challenge his steadfast logic. Began with the journal. Entries were initially mundane, observations of weather and sea conditions, but gradually a peculiar theme emerged. Wrote of a presence in the lighthouse, a benevolent but persistent entity he referred to only as the companion. He described fleeting glimpses of a shadowy figure at the periphery of his vision, the faint sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase when no one else was there, and a peculiar whistling tune that would sometimes drift from the lantern room. Seemed to view the companion with a mixture of apprehension and a strange sort of affection, as if it were a lonely fellow traveler in the vast solitude of the sea. David, reading these entries, initially dismissed them as the ramblings of a man driven stir-crazy by isolation. But then, the occurrences began for him. The first was the whistling. It was a simple tune, almost a sea shanty, and it seemed to originate from the very top of the lighthouse, the lantern room, always in the quietest hours of the night. David would climb the winding stairs, flashlight in hand, to investigate, only to find the room empty, the only sound the ceaseless moan of the wind and the distant crash of the waves. Yet as he descended, the tune would sometimes pick up again, faint and teasing as if receding with him. Then came the footsteps. A slow, deliberate tread on the metal steps of the spiral staircase, always just a few steps behind him, or sometimes preceding him, as if someone else was climbing or descending at the same pace. He'd stop, listen, but the sounds would cease, only to resume the moment he moved again. It was a playful yet deeply unsettling game, designed to constantly remind him he was not alone. David started to notice other things. His tools, meticulously arranged, would sometimes be found slightly out of place. A cup of coffee left on the table would be lukewarm when he returned minutes later, as if someone had taken a sip. And the cold spots, distinct pockets of icy air, would drift through the living quarters, lingering for a moment before dissipating. He tried to rationalize it all. The whistling was the wind, the footsteps the settling of the old structure, the moving objects his own absent-mindedness. But the sheer consistency, the relentless repetition of these small, impossible events began to wear him down. He reread's journal, now seeing it not as madness, but as a chilling chronicle of his own unfolding experience. The companion, it seemed, was making itself known. One particularly stormy night, the wind howling like a banshee and the waves battering the rocks below, David was in the lantern room making his routine checks. The light, a massive Fresnel lens, cast its powerful beam into the maelstrom. Suddenly, the entire room went dark. The beam winked out, plunging the top of the lighthouse into absolute blackness. A jolt of panic shot through David. This had never happened before. The mechanism was robust, designed to withstand any conditions. As he fumbled for his emergency lantern, a cold hand, impossibly cold and unseen, seemed to brush against his arm. He gasped, dropping his flashlight, and in the sudden, profound darkness, he heard the whistling tune, clear and distinct, right next to his ear, followed by a soft, almost mournful sigh. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the light flickered back on, its powerful beam once again piercing the night. David stood there, trembling, his breath ragged, staring at the empty space where the cold touch had been. He knew with an absolute terrifying certainty that Blackwood had not vanished by chance. He had been taken, or perhaps chosen to join the companion in some ethereal vigil. And now the companion was making its presence known to him, a new, lonely keeper. He finished his shift that night, but the experience left an indelible mark. He no longer dismissed his journal as madness. He understood it. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon for ships. It was a beacon for something else, something ancient and tied to the relentless rhythm of the sea. David stayed at the lighthouse for another year, the companion a constant, silent presence in his life. He learned its patterns, its subtle ways of communicating, and sometimes in the deepest part of his solitude, he would hum the whistling tune himself, a quiet. He never saw a full apparition, never spoke directly to it, but the feeling of being watched, of sharing his solitary life with an unseen entity, became his new normal. He left the post eventually, not out of fear, but because the loneliness, compounded by the constant, gentle haunting, began to feel too heavy. He left his own journal behind, a cryptic entry on the last page. The companion watches. It waits, and it is never truly alone. The lighthouse, standing stoic against the wild Maine coast, continues its vigil, a silent witness to the endless cycle of the sea and to the quiet whispers of the past that sometimes choose to linger, sharing their lonely watch with those who are brave enough to listen.